sorry.
I'm going to use my own computer.
You sure?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I actually happen to be with Anna
Merhaba
today.
Clarissa, hoş geldin.
Welcome, Clarissa. Glad to see you here. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm just going to share my screen. Desktop.
Çok teşekkür ederiz. Ben de seni tanıtayım çok kısa.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce you very briefly. Well, colleagues, Clarissa Morawski is in Reloop's CEO in Brussels. She's the chairperson of Reloop and in the EU Parliament, involved in many actions and observing the actions taken in this field and passing this information, sharing this information with us. And she's going to speak about the development of DRS in Europe. And after that, we will address our questions to her. And after Clarissa, Anna will stay with us because she would like to show us some further collection point photos, and we will have an opportunity to see further examples. The floor is yours, Clarissa. You can start whenever you like.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's roll. I've got a big presentation. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the European legal framework, and we're going to focus on the newest legislation that was published in 2019, the Single-Use Plastics Directive. I'm sure you've heard about it. I'm going to cover the 4 top things that you need to know about it. The first thing that the Single-Use Plastics Directive covers is it bans a series of single-use plastic products, and I've listed them here, but they are everything from ear cleaning, plastic earbuds, plastic cutlery, forks, spoons, chopsticks, plates, stirrers, straws, balloon sticks, oxo-degradable plastics, and expanded polystyrene, which are used for food containers and cups, typically for takeout restaurants. These products technically are banned by July 2021, although there may be some allowances for delay given COVID. However, that's very much in play right now. The second thing that the Single-Use Directive does is it creates more extended producer responsibility on products that have typically not been covered by EPR. Things like wet wipes, they're like wet Kleenexes that are used to wipe babies' bottoms. They have some plastic in it and are often thrown down the toilet and are very problematic. They're required, for example, tobacco companies will be required to put money in to an EPR organization to cover the costs of transportation, collection, transport, treatment, and litter collection costs. And this is the newest thing, and we've never seen this anywhere else in the world, that extended producer responsibility costs will now be expanded to include the cost of litter collection. So really what this means is, given that it is typically municipalities that are going out and cleaning beaches, cleaning parks, cleaning streets, that they will get financing to help offset those costs, and that financing comes from the brand owners. And this is a list of all the other packaging that is covered. Yes, of course, beverage containers is already covered by EPR, but they never had to pay for litter costs. So now beverage producers like Coke and Pepsi will have to pay for the collection costs of litter. So you can see that that's one of the reasons why the brand owners are starting to embrace deposit return, because they know that their costs of EPR are inflating, and a DRS is a very good way to go because the costs will remain stable. The third thing has to do with design. And here we have 2 key provisions. The first one has to do with a requirement by 2024 to make sure that the cap is connected to the bottle. And you have one example here in this picture, but there's many different design ways of doing it. There will be some guidance released by the Commission quite shortly for the producer so they can basically get their molds, their new molds ready so that they can create these new caps. But that was typically, it was introduced because They were finding caps on beaches and in litter, and they wanted to make sure that it was connected to the bottle so it was easier to collect. The other key thing, which was actually added in at the last minute, is a recycled content target of 25% for PET beverage bottles by 2025 and 30% for all plastic beverage bottles, not just PET, by 2030. So you can imagine that this is a key provision which has suddenly increased the demand for good quality rPET. And I say this because if Turkey has a deposit return system and you're collecting a good deposit return system and you're collecting a lot of good quality PET and recycled into rPET in Turkey, you have a fantastic market to sell it to. So the deposit return system in Turkey should be seen as a real opportunity to trade commodities with Europe. The fourth piece of the single-use directive is a collection target for beverage bottles with plastic beverage bottles with a capacity of up to 3 liters, including the caps and lids, which shouldn't be too difficult because they're going to be attached to the bottles. And there's 2 targets. One is 77 by 2025, and the other one is 90% by 2029. The law says that member states can achieve the target 2 ways. The first way is, of course, by introducing a deposit return. Or they wanted to give a little bit of flexibility. They could also try to achieve it through extended producer responsibility systems. Like, for example, you might see something in Belgium where they're going to try to get to 90 using their curbside system, putting bins on the streets and in all the office buildings. I wish them luck. I don't think they're going to make it. But nonetheless, the Commission was quite flexible on this. So that's the single-use directive, and that is why we're seeing so much activity on deposit return in Europe, and I'll show you the map in a second. Then we also have another key piece that's coming up, which is about recycled content. And we have a lot of, not only in Europe, but globally, brands are starting to make commitments to put more recycled content in their bottles. There are many life cycle assessments. We're putting this up because we wanted to show you why they're making these commitments. That the beverage packaging is the most carbon intensive part of a beverage. It's not the beverage itself, it's the packaging. And this chart, without getting into the numbers, what I want you to see is that deep decline as we increase the amount of recycled content in a PET bottle. The carbon footprint drops dramatically. Here you have at the bottom, at the end, 100%, very, very small carbon footprint, whereas on this side, you only have 11%. And the beverage brands, they know this. This is just one study from Norway, but every study basically looks the same. You have that dramatic curve because you get so much benefit from putting more recycled content. And this is just for PET. If I were to put an aluminum can up here, it would be even more dramatic. Glass, a little bit less dramatic, but simply to say that recycled content is an incredibly powerful way for a brand owner to reduce its carbon footprint and to reach its sustainability goals. So what we have, aside from the single-use directive, the requirements, is we also have the brands, big global companies that are making commitments, voluntary pledges. Procter & Gamble, it's not just beverage, they have many, many non-food products in non-food plastic containers like hair, shampoo bottles, etc. I'm not going to go through them all. You're going to have the slide, but simply to say that the brands are really starting to make these commitments. They really want to access clean material so that they can get good quality rPET or R polyolefin material to incorporate into new bottles. This is a very, very, very recent development, I would say. It's because of the climate change agenda, because they know they have to do this. So this also helps governments to introduce policies like DRS because it very much supports the brands. Now let's talk a little bit about the collection of beverage containers through DRS. So on the left of this slide, you will see that the return rates in the deposit systems for PET are very, very high. These are the collection rates, and you can see they're very, very high. And because the material is only plastic beverage containers, that material is easily put back into new containers. So it's very attractive for the brands because they can easily recycle it and meet all of the requirements at an EU level, which is very strict about food content plastic. When you have a deposit system that's only collecting PET beverage containers, then you know there's absolutely no contamination in there. There isn't a chemical bottle in the mix, which you might find in a household curbside collection system. So that is very supportive. The high collection rates in a DRS really support the food quality. Now, it's very small here, but you can also see that this is a requirement. This is in Norway. The system operator says, we want to support our brand owners who sit on our board and run the system. We run it for them. And in doing so, we're going to require that if they want to be part of our system, there are some requirements on design. And this that you see here, you can't see the details, but there's some things that you're allowed to put on a plastic bottle, and there's some things that you're not. There's certain glues, certain types of plastic for the cap. If that's how you're going to design your bottle, they will not allow you to be part of the system. And similarly, even though there's certain things that are not required, there are also certain things that might be preferred, like color. And here on the right, you can see what the EPR fees are to the producers per unit. Everything, as Anna said, is in units. And you can see this is in Norwegian crown, but it's basically equivalent to let's look at the plastic. You're looking at about 0.1 cent, around 1 cent for the plastic is the basic. And then if you want to go in a light blue container, you have to pay a little bit more because it's not as good for recycling. It would be much better if it was clear. So they have what we call modulated fees, which are effectively get a little bit bigger if you are designing a bottle that is not as good as if it was, for example, a clear bottle. So that also motivates producers to put better designed bottles on the market. Let's talk about the consumer perception. So on the left, this is also in a fact sheet that we have on our website, you can see that there is a lot of the public is in favor of DRS. This chart on the left are all of the most recent public polls that have been taken around the world. They're all in a fact sheet on our website. You can find it very easily under fact sheets. And you can see that over on the median is 81% of the population support deposit return. So we know that consumers like it. And this is quite interesting, a development in Sweden. As you may or may not know, or I'll show you in a second, Tetra Pak or juice boxes are not part of the DRS in Sweden. And we're seeing that juices, which are typically put in boxes in Sweden, are now, the producers are starting to switch to plastic bottles that are in the DRS. And they're doing that because they know that consumers want to buy a package that they know is going to be handled properly. And in Sweden, they know that the DRS system handles the containers properly. And in fact, in Sweden, there's a recycling facility right next to the handling center that Anna talked about earlier, where they're recycling the PET into clean rPET flake to be put right back into a new bottle. So it is a real closed loop, as this symbol indicates. For PET in Sweden, it's a closed loop system, and that has actually attracted market share. Let's take a quick look at what's going on in Europe. This is a map of what it looked like when ReLoop was founded in 2015. We had about 10 member states in Europe that have a deposit return system, with Lithuania being the last one to have been introduced in 2016. This is what it's going to look like in the next 3 or 4 years. In light green are all of the countries in Europe that have legislated to introduce a deposit system. It is in law. In some cases, it's just being developed. You're here as well. You can see Turkey, but in other cases, it is very much developed and will be implemented soon. So we've seen a huge surge of new systems being introduced. Yes, it's because of the single-use directive and the 90% target. Yes, it's because of a 25% mandatory recycled content target. And yes, producers are starting to lobby in favor of DRS throughout Europe. And that's why we're seeing these developments. What's going to happen in the future? Well, just to give you a sense, if we look at the world, there are, up to today, this is the amount of the population of the world that are covered by a DRS system. And we're at about 300 million people today. But because of what's going on in Europe and in Turkey, that number of people covered by deposits at a global level will rise to over 500 million. So you can see that there's a real trend to move to DRS at a global level. But let's go back to Europe. These are what I like to call the hotspots, where we don't have legislation in place, but there is a lot of discussion, a lot of political interest. And of course, the brands are also in many of these countries working towards a DRS. So they have not put it in legislation, but there is a potential to get there. And I suspect that by 2029, all of Europe will be under a DRS system. So now let's get into some of the technical details. These slides are nice summary charts that Anna has prepared, and let's just walk through them. So we have centralized clearing, or a centralized system that I think you're going to be hearing about from some centralized system operators today in most countries in Europe. The only country that is not a centralized system is in Germany. It's a decentralized system. It's a very different system. It's a more complicated system, and I would argue it's a more expensive system, simply because you don't have one entity coordinating everything. You have hundreds of entities coordinating everything. So even though we love Germany because the deposit is high, the technology is fantastic, you can take your container back anywhere, the fact that it's decentralized definitely adds complexity, not for the consumer, but it adds complexity for both the producers and also for the retailers. Most systems in Europe are EPR systems. So the producers are basically responsible for managing the system. We do have one state operator, that is Croatia. We do not recommend a state operator. Globally, we have a state operator in California, and we have a state operator in a little province in my country of Canada. Typically, they're not well organized. They're outdated, and the producers have no ability to influence the direction of the program. Return to retail in Europe, it's everywhere with the exception of Ireland, where you have redemption centers. In North America, it's a different situation. It's usually a combination of redemption centers and retail, but we know that retail is the best, it's the easiest, and it results in the lowest carbon emissions because it doesn't require any additional trips. It's also the most equitable. Now we're starting to talk about equity, about poor people being able to get their deposit back, not having to get into a car that they may not have, not having to walk 4 kilometers. When you have a return to retail system and everybody is obligated to take back the containers, that is the most equitable for all citizens. And next we have the barcode. Yes, of course, you need a barcode. The only jurisdiction that doesn't have a barcode in Europe is Croatia, but all modern systems are relying on barcodes because it gives you the data that you need, the accuracy that you need, and of course, it prevents a lot of fraud. And finally, obligated by law. Most jurisdictions have an obligation in law, but Anna, as she talked about the tax system in Finland and Norway, which I actually really like, but it has to be a government that's willing to impose that kind of tax, where they've simply just said, if you don't reach these collection targets, you pay a huge tax. And that's why the system works in Norway and Finland. But typically, you need to have the requirements in an obligation of law. This is what's coming up. I think it's quite consistent that these countries, Slovakia, Latvia, Malta, Scotland, where they're already into the system design, are going with what the rest of Europe is doing. Centralized clearing, managed by producers, return to retail, barcode, and it will be a statute in law. Now, here are some photographs of what return to retail looks like from a forward-facing perspective. As Anna said, it could be refillable, non-refillable. The consumer comes to the shop. In most big shops have machines, of course. Little shops, they may not have a machine, but I don't know if Anna mentioned this. Typically, when we look at where the bulk of the containers are coming back, even though we have lots and lots of little small shops, more generally about 90% come back through the big shops, through the machines. So in fact, small retailers, they're really only getting a little bit of the containers back. So it's not like small retailers are going to be inundated with mountains of empty containers. That just doesn't occur, because typically when people want to bring a lot of their containers back, they're doing it when they're doing a big shop and they're going to the big grocery store versus going to a little grocery store. But we can see, different iterations. This one is a return center that is in a parking lot. I think this one is in Lithuania or in Estonia. Here you have in the bottom of a parking lot, you can see the machines right there. And then you also have them sort of, at the back of the building. This is a retailer and you just have to go to the back of the building. So there's a little bit of flexibility, but the point is it's got to be really, really close to where you're doing your shopping. We don't want to see people walking 2 kilometers. We don't want to see them having to get on a bus, pack up their car. It has to be equitable. It's about equity. And here's some other photographs. This picture is a manual collection point. And you can see that it's very simple. They just have these bags here. When the retailer gets the containers back, they just put them in the bag. When the bags are full, they communicate with the system operator, and the system operator comes and takes the bags from the retailer. From a carbon perspective, this is a study that was done, but it's been proven that deposit return has a much better carbon profile than if you were to try to collect the containers via curbside or other types of systems. Why? Because you're using the same trip to go to the collection point, so there's no additional emissions there because you're going shopping anyway. The material most of it is compacted in the machine, consolidated, and then the logistics are optimized. So it's a very clean system versus the alternative, which would be curbside collection and bins on every street, no compaction. That's much more carbon intensive. So we know that deposit has a better overall profile than curbside when it comes to beverage containers. On barcode, this is simply the form in Norway that producers are required to register their barcodes into the system. Sometimes there's a fee for a first-time registration as you bring a new product line onto the market. But as Anna mentioned, all beverage containers have a barcode. Those barcodes are in the system. The minute those barcodes are put on the market, there's a deposit that is charged, and then all of a sudden they're in the program. And those barcodes are effectively destroyed when they go through the machine after the deposit is given back. So it's a very fraud-proof system, actually. It's the only way to really avoid fraud. There was a question about which countries have different materials. Here you can see the European countries, the vast majority of them have all three container types, with the exception of Norway and Sweden, and Netherlands don't have glass. Netherlands has a lot of refillable glass, however, and the Netherlands today doesn't have cans, but cans are going to be introduced in about a year, I think. So this actually slide should be updated. We'll put a little red dot here because the Netherlands is recently modernized their system and the government introduced cans, of course. This is a chart that shows you what beverages are covered. And as you can see, water, soft drinks, beer are always typically covered, and cider, alcohol beverages in Europe, typically most of the time. But then as we get into wine and spirits, it starts to lessen a little bit. So you can see that not all the beverage containers are covered, but we do advocate that all beverages be covered. And the trend is that new beverages are being added. For example, in my own home province of Quebec in Canada, they are now modernizing their deposit system. They're adding wine, spirits, milk, and actually Tetra Pak. And this is very typical. Germany will also be adding milk to the German system. So we're really starting to see that evolve as well. And of course, there's some concerns about milk and is it going to be a problem? But so far, there hasn't seemed to be any real issues with it, because in the grand scheme of things, as it relates to plastic milk containers, it's a fairly small portion of the total plastic beverage market. A little bit on DRS principles. These are the Coke principles. These are principles of best-in-class DRS that has been produced by Coke. And this came out a few years ago. And we were so happy to see this because it was exactly in line with how we think about deposit return, that we believe that there needs to be a set of guiding principles that need to be met to guide governments and industry to understand what is the best way to introduce a DRS. And I'm not going to go through them all, but they're very close to our principles as well. And it's everything from, let me just say, things like, that DRS has to be financed by producers, that the system should include revenue from the sale of material, unredeemed deposits, and a fee from the producers. 3 revenue streams, standard stuff. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will say this, and this is quite interesting. I showed you the Coke principles, but there are more organizations in the beverage sector or associations in the beverage sector that are also coming out with the same principles. So we're starting to see real unity within the beverage sector. And I can also tell you that I'm currently working with the European Soft Drink Association and the European Water Association. They're called Natural Mineral Waters Europe. We're working together to try to get these principles, or basically most of these principles, into law at a European Union level, so that the key things that we know have to happen, like a 90% target, like producer responsibility for beverage containers, the country doesn't run the system, that the system should be open for refillables and designed so that we can have refillables as well. Things like return to retail is a must. These are the kinds of things that the beverage industry themselves are agreeing to, and now they're asking governments to put it in law at a European Union level, so that member state governments that have to actually introduce it aren't going to mess it up because of the politics in their country or certain stakeholders in their country. They're going to do what's right, that the beverage industry knows works, that is an assurance that every country in Europe is going to at least do the most important things. So I think that's a very important development, and you'll probably start to hear a little bit more from this coalition. that's really pushing for these best-in-class principles to be put in law. And I think with that, I'm just going to close by reminding everybody that ReLoop has a global deposit book. It's available on our website. It was just updated again, and it has a summary of every single deposit system in the world where we at least have information on it. There's a few little ones that we don't have information, but it can give you a really good sense of, it's like a reference book. If you ever want to know if one country, how they do things, it's how the system operates, what's the deposit level, who's responsible, who's on the board, just go to the deposit book and everything is in there. And finally, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to open it up for questions.
Clarissa, çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
Thank you so much, Clarissa. It's been very beneficial, very fruitful. It's been very, very informing, all that you've said. So I've taken a couple of notes, actually, as you were presenting. You're talking about 500 million people that are involved that will be living, or are they living, or will they be living within the system? Because it's a huge number. Is this in the present or in the future? 500 million people involved in the system.
It's in the next, by 2025, I believe it is. That's the amount of people. There will be 500 people in the world living in a country with a deposit return system. It is huge, huge. But that's because we have countries like Romania, 20 million, Portugal, 10 million, Turkey, 80 million, England, 65 million, so these are big countries. They're bringing big populations on board. So it's very exciting from a circular economy perspective, because it's going to provide a lot more material to recycle.
Ağırlıklı olarak aslında Avrupa Birliği'nden
Predominantly, we're talking about the EU, but Canada and the USA also have improvements on the current systems. That's what I know based on my research. And in the meantime, in Australia, for example, we're talking about a huge geography there, and they are generalizing the system all across the country, and it's already running DRS, because after all these forest fires, they want to take the case of deposit system more seriously. And in Turkic republics, there are also certain initiatives that are being uptaken, and we at TÜÇEM receive some information from Turkic republics, and they also take pictures of the collection points and send them to us, and that's making us really, really happy. So activities are underway in those countries as well. There are certain examples from them too. So in terms of decentralized system fees, you mentioned them. So you talked about how in decentralized systems, the costs are higher, yes. And the producer and also the entity that puts the market, retailers bear the cost to a large extent. Yes, these are very, very important notes for us to take. I have another question. Here in Turkey, there is a question that we're discussing in some of the meetings that we take. QR code, barcode, or both, in terms of reliable, safe collection. So in order to prevent fraud, do you suggest barcode, QR code, or both? What's your suggestion?
Well, the barcode is sufficient. And I'm not sure why the QR code is being proposed. Maybe they're looking at a digital system, I guess. But the barcode is sufficient. If you want to put a QR code, you can put a QR code. It's not really going to change anything in terms of the system, because they still need to be read, they still need to be counted, they still need to be destroyed. But that QR code is going to be a burden on the producers, and in particular on the smaller producers. So typically a barcode, we know it works. I'm not sure why you'd want to deviate from a barcode unless you were perhaps a refillable container. And then the Q code could be an individual code that could give you information about the refillable bottle itself, and you could track how many times it's come back through the system. So that for refillables, it makes sense maybe, or any reusable packaging. But for single-use containers, the barcode is sufficient.
Evet. Dedin ki vergi olayına
You
değindin.
talked
Finlandiya
about tax, and in Finland and Norway, in taxation, there are certain taxation levels based on collection rates. So the collector, let's say, pays less tax if they collect high amounts, and if they collect less, then they pay higher tax. So the collector bears tax rate in that level, in that shifting level. Is that correct?
No, it's not the collector, it's the brand owner, it's the producer. So Coke will pay the
piyasaya süren.
tax. It's not the collector. So Coke sells 100 bottles. He doesn't meet his target. So for all the bottles that, like Anna showed you, between what he's collected but the target, all those bottles, let's say it's 100 units times the tax. It's a €0.5, basically, 50 cents. That's a big tax. And that's why they've organized such a fantastic system, because they want to make sure they avoid the tax. So they've designed a perfect deposit system that gets extremely high rates.
Sorulara bakıyorum şimdi.
So I'm looking at the questions now. Like you've mentioned in the presentation, packages in the EU DRS system are limited to 3 liters. Is that due to technical limitations or due to low demand to such large packages?
It was done mainly for technical reasons, but it was also because there's not a lot above and beyond 3 liters. So it was mainly for technical reasons, so that the machines could be used. So the commission actually went to the technical providers and said, what's the biggest volume that we can manage in a machine and that makes sense? And also remember, the 90% is about single-use plastics that are typically problematic. So anything beyond 3 liters, it's not like you find these big, huge plastic containers on the beach. So it wasn't really a targeted item. They were going for the smaller ones.
Yani sorunun devamı da şöyle.
And the rest of the question is this. In Turkey, we have high levels of use of 5-liter beverage containers. So 3-liter limitation would exclude 5-liter containers, and that could pose environmental problems. So what do you view that, for example?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you. We'd need to assess it technically and find a solution for it. But I mean, these big bottles should ultimately be reusable, frankly. When they're that big, they could be reusable. I know that's maybe not the answer, but it does seem ridiculous to have a single-use container with so much material. I mean, these are almost the sizes of reusable water jugs that are on the market in Europe. But we don't have a solution for those right now. I guess it would be manual. You'd have to take them back to a manual point. But they're very, they'd have to be compacted on the spot, crushed.
Evet, gördüğüm kadarıyla başka bir soru
I
yok.
guess I cannot see any more questions from the friends. Well,